So, John R. Jordan has been working with suicide loss survivors for over 40 years. And so, over this time, he's identified some themes that make suicide loss bereavement different, thematically different from other forms of bereavement. So, generally speaking, when a person loses a loved one to suicide, generally speaking, that means it's not for everybody, but generally most people will find these elements in their wrestling of suicide loss. The mourner needs to make sense and explain the suicide death. What happened? Why did it happen? Why this way? All of these questions. The mourner goes through an experience of guilt and responsibility. My place in this death, and etc. And you'll get to look over these questions in your PDF and kind of ponder how they apply to you. The experience of stigma and shame around the suicide death. Have you noticed that, it's easier to tell people about other means of death versus suicide death, suicide loss? The experience of isolation from support systems. Research shows that loved ones who've lost someone to suicide have a more difficult time showing up in support groups and actually naming that they lost a loved one to suicide. The increase of suicidal tendencies and PTSD symptoms from the mode of death. So research also shows that those who've lost a loved one to suicide, specifically who had a very close perception, a closeness to them, will experience greater tendencies of their own struggles with suicidality. And here's a big one, PTSD symptoms from the mode of death. So how did your loved one die? Even if you didn't see them die, the mode of death could be so traumatic or so distressful that your brain will create images and will imagine this way of death. And that can contribute to then post-traumatic stress down the road. And so your brain is going to sometimes have a hard time processing through these images, depending on what it is that your mind and your brain are coming up with as far as the mode of death. So, due to these elements, Jordan suggests that certain psychological tasks must be integrated for there to be resolution of a suicide loss. So we're going to discuss these tasks. There's 7 of them. So the first task is, and this is a really important one that we will work on in the next segment. So it's containment of trauma and restoration of a sense of psychological safety and control. So containment of trauma means that we need to reprocess any traumatic symptoms associated with the mode of death. Specifically, how did your loved one die, right? And so bring back a restoration of psychological safety to your nervous system. And so we will talk a little bit more in the next segment about how that works, how your body takes in traumatic experiences, even if you're not in the experience and you're just hearing about the experience, okay? So task number 2 is repair of the mourner's assumptive worldview. Many times during a traumatic death, like a suicide loss, our assumptive worldview, which is how we see the world, how we make sense of the world, how we make sense of pain and suffering, good and evil, these beliefs and these structures that we create for ourselves, they clash, they collapse. It's like the house, the psychological house that you've been living in, it just comes crashing down and you find yourself houseless, homeless, right? So it's really important to repair, let's just say this house, the psychological house, and we call that our worldview, and we need then more integrated structures to build the worldviews that we live in. So In task 2, we will create new adaptive beliefs, ones that we can move forward in our journeys that will actually help us to face crises and difficult experiences in life. So task 3 is self-dosing, creation of a psychological sanctuary and relief from the pain. So grief is a process. It's not something that has a beginning and an end. It's something that it's like a journey that we're on, and it slowly integrates into our life, right? And so with that said, you want to imagine creating a psychological sanctuary, like a home that you can make for yourself, that you can allow yourself to grieve and face the loss and face the reality of the loss, but also then go into this home and reprieve and rest. And this has many ways of being done. And we will talk about that deeper in another segment, okay? And so another way to look at that is when you go to the gym and you're working out and you are pulling a lot of weights or running, you need to take breaks from that in order for your body to rest so that it can keep facing harder weights. So psychologically, this is what we're doing, is we need to have a sanctuary or safe place that we can go to with our attention and grow that. And so that can be there for us. And then we can oscillate between facing the pain and the suffering and the difficulties in our life, and then also then taking rest in our sanctuaries. So task 4 is development of social management skills. The reality is suicide is still a weird conversation. We don't like that S word. We don't like to talk about it. We as a society, we're getting better, and research shows that there's less stigma. And with that, it is still very difficult to talk about. It's still very difficult to face. And so part of resolving a loss in our life that is attached to a suicide mode of death, we need to learn how to develop social management skills, which means that how do we allow ourselves to tell the story and face the story and the reality in our society, in our community, and at the same time manage what people may be projecting onto us or what we may be projecting onto others based on our preformed beliefs about suicide loss or suicide death, okay? So we will go through that too. Task number 5 has to do with the repair of the relationship with the deceased, okay? So that's very important. What is unresolved? Is there anger? Is there sadness? Is there fear attached to your relationship with your loved one? Things that have been unsaid, unfaced, closure that needs to happen, right? So that needs to be faced if we're going to create a new bond with the loved one and then integrate that and move forward with our lives, okay? Task number 6 has to do with developing a durable biography of the deceased. Many times when we lose a loved one, and that could be to suicide loss, it could be to homicide, it could be to a sickness or a disease, our brains tend to remember them as they passed away, as they died, right? And then get stuck in that memory, stuck in that image, stuck in that story. And yet, our loved one has had an entire life that is full of good and bad, resilient and struggle, right? Our loved one has a full story. And part of resolving a suicide loss is developing a fact-based meaningful biography of our loved one that is fair, one is that is coherent, one that encompasses their entire life and not just the way that they died, okay? Task 7 is reinvestment into living. How are we going to take all of this that we've learned? How are we going to take the new elements that have come out of us through this crisis and integrate that back into life, put that back into the world around us? And so we will be, in the next segments, we will be integrating the developmental lens of grieving and the tasks that must be faced, Jordan's tasks, in order to help you essentially create a foundation, right? And on this foundation, you can keep grieving because grief is a process. Sometimes it's months, sometimes it's years, and sometimes, you will feel better and something will trigger you and it will bring you back to a moment or bring you back to something that has not been resolved. And right, you can use this foundation on which you can stand and then create meaning and resolution and purpose to move forward. So what I want you to do now is refer to your PDF and look at the questions on the PDF and take some time to reflect on this mini segment, what we've talked about. Ask yourself, is there something maybe that it really hit me that this was for me? And then ask yourself what's not for you, right? And then focus on what specifically is for you and put the other stuff to the side. So sometimes some things can connect with us now and other things not. And then later on, new elements of grief will come up for you. And you can refer to this segment and notice that, oh, I'm connecting with this part now. And so keep that in mind and take some time to reflect. And I will see you in the next segment.